How are we doing today, guys? Give me a thumbs up in the chat. Just let me know that the audio and everything is going good. If you can. Hope everybody's doing well today. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to talk to you guys about important theological and philosophical terms. So what I did is compile a list of terms that I thought are worthy of discussion. And so today, I'm sure some of them you guys have probably already heard of, some of them you're already going to be familiar with, you know what they mean. But I thought it'd be useful to just kind of systematically go through commonly used philosophical and theological terms that I use on this channel. You might hear Jay Dyer, Father Deacon Dr. Ananias, various people out there use these terms, and I thought it'd just be useful then to just give the clear definition of all this stuff and just kind of talk about it. So so that's what we are going to be doing. If you guys can, please hit that like button. As always, it always helps in the algorithm, of course. So let's see. I'm just going to make sure that we're streaming well on all different platforms. Look like we are good to go. So before I get into it, I do want to mention, as always, if you guys appreciate what we're doing on this YouTube channel and online generally speaking, and you're in a position in which you would like to aid or contribute to what I'm trying to do, if you would, you could go to davidpatrickharry.com. As you'll see, that is now on the screen right now. And in the top right-hand corner, there is a donate button for those who would be interested to set up potentially a $5 a month donation, and that is going to greatly help what I'm trying to do on this YouTube channel, and that will automatically get you a website membership as well when those become available. So just want to throw that out there as usual before we get going here. So without further ado, be talking about a handful of terms, or more than a handful. It's actually like on Apple Pages, I think I have like 10 pages of just definitions. So that's what we're going to be doing, and let's start. So the first term we're going to be getting into, and again, some of these guys you are already going to be familiar with, some of them you may not be, and some of them you may have heard of or have an idea. And so today's video is to really clarify and give a definite structure to these terms and concepts. So the first one is acomism. Acomism. And it's probably a term that you guys think, well, I haven't heard that one before, but actually you already are familiar with this concept. We've talked about it in regards to the Hindu-Buddhist concept of Maya. And so acomism is the philosophy that denies the reality of the universe, seeing it as ultimately illusory and only the infinite, unmanifest absolute as real. In contrast to pantheism, acosmism. Okay, actually there should be an S in there. Let me check my acosmism. There we go. I misspelt it. Acosmism begins with the recognition that there is only one reality, which is infinite, non-dual, blissful, etc. So we get into the Advaita Vedanta schools of Hinduism with that non-duality. So a lot of you guys are probably already going to be familiar with that. But non-dualism is going to be a big part of this worldview. Yet the phenomenal reality of which humans are normally aware is none of these things. It is in fact just the opposite, i.e. dualistic, finite, full of suffering and pain, and so on. And since the absolute is the only reality, that means that everything that is not absolute cannot be real. Thus, according to this viewpoint, the phenomenal dualistic world is ultimately an illusion, Maya, to use the technical Indian term. Irrespective of the apparent reality it possesses at the mundane or empirical level. And so acosmism is a term that I think is worth knowing. And is a concept that we've already talked about in previous streams, previous videos, and such. So next concept that I wanted to go over. Here, let me make sure I change all these words. I wanted to keep them up on the screen here. So let me change all this in OBS. All right. And the next one is anti-nominalism. Anti-nominalism. Well, what? Some of you guys have probably, again, already heard of this. You may already be familiar. Anti-nominalism is, in theology, the idea that members of a particular religious group are under no obligation to obey the laws or ethics or morality as presented by religious authorities. Anti-nominalism is the polar opposite of legalism, the notion that obedience to a code of religious law is necessary for salvation. The term has become a point of contention among opposed religious authorities. Few groups or sects explicitly call themselves antinomian, but the charge is often leveled by some sects competing against other sects. So anti-nominalism, and we're going to get into legalism and all this. So any term that comes up and says that it is the opposite of one or the other, or that it's a debated philosophical school, and usually the antagonistic tradition is this or that. I've already included both, so today's video is going to be a progression in alphabetical order, so you have to bear with when we come to terms that we haven't got to yet, or we're referencing them, but that is anti-nominalism, this idea that somehow you are not obligated to obey the laws of ethics or morality as presented by religious authorities. The laws of ethics or morality presented by religious authorities. And so this leads us to the next term. Let me change this real quick. Classicism. Classicism. I've used this term before in referencing the Renaissance, when we were talking about Marsilio Ficino and the Hermetic translation project of the 15th century, we talked about how much of the Renaissance was wrapped up in a form of classicism. And this has to do with the high regard of antiquity. And somehow that antiquity was in a place that we had fallen from. So we were almost at a sort of a lower state than where they were previously in different aspects. Now, again, this was debated, but generally speaking, this concept of classicism came about. And so classicism in the arts is a high regard for classical antiquity as setting standards for taste that the classicist seeks to emulate. Classicism is usually contrasted with romanticism. The art of classicism typically seeks to be formal, restrained, and Apollonian, nothing in excess, rather than Dionysiac, meaning excessive. And this is in reference to Friedrich Nietzsche's opposition, in which he talks about this. It can also refer to the other periods of classicism. For example, in theater, classicism was developed in the 17th century French playwrights from what they judged to be the rules of Greek classical theater, including the classical unities of time, place, and action. Now, let me see real quick if I can actually pull up my list so you guys could see it. That might be helpful too. Let's see here. Window capture. Here we go. So why don't we do this? So as we move through here, in fact, I guess I could probably just take this word off and we could just use use the list right here. So that was classicism in the arts. So again, this high regard for classical antiquity. As I mentioned, this was discussed in the Renaissance when we talked about Marsilio Ficino, and sort of in the Renaissance, generally speaking, they were sort of infatuated with a classical understanding in regards to classicism. So The next one that I wanted to talk about, again, people throw this term around all the time, but do we know what exactly it is? And that is classical liberalism. And that is a political ideology. And so we've talked about classical liberals and all this stuff. And as fundamental Christians, as Orthodox Christians, we tend to take umbrage with some of the commentators that identify as classical liberalism, because all this is post-Enlightenment ideas, again, regarded in humanism, concepts of progress, concepts of utilitarianism, and all this stuff, which we would reject because of the presuppositions and really where that stuff has led. So what is classical liberalism? Well, it's a political ideology and a branch of liberalism which advocates civil liberties under the rule of law with an emphasis on economic freedom. Closely related to economic liberalism, it developed in the early 19th century, building on the ideas from the previous century as a response to urbanization and to the Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America. Notable liberal individuals whose ideas contributed to classical liberalism include John Locke, Jean-Baptiste Dessay, Thomas Robert Malthus, and David Ricardo. It drew on classical economics, especially the economic ideas espoused by Adam Smith in Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations, and on behalf in a belief in natural law, progress, and utilitarianism, things that I just mentioned previously. As a term, classical liberalism has often been applied in retrospect to distinguish earlier 19th century liberalism from social liberalism. And so that concept of progress, that's again why we call part of the political landscape progressives. They're wrapped up. Of course, a lot of people would say, well, they're not ultimately classical liberals with their promotion of socialism and things like that. That would be antagonistic to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and his kind of putting out of private property, free markets, capitalism, generally speaking, all that. So we would definitely say that progressives per se aren't classical liberals, but classical liberalism, I would argue, gave rise to what we would call modern day progressives and stuff like that. To a degree, of course, we're going to get into dialectical materialism and related to Marxist thought and stuff like that. So we will be referencing that. I have that as one of the definitions as well. So the next term that I chose was coherentism. Coherentism. And the reason why I chose that term is because we talk about various theories of truth, right? When we've done various apologetic videos, on my video on how to prove God to an atheist, where we discuss the tag argument, the transcendental argument for God, and how we're really approaching at a sort of presuppositional level, a paradigmatic level. This is going to even be tied to transcendental idealism of Immanuel Kant, which we will get to at the very end of this list. But our transcendental arguments for God depend on a different theory of truth. And so we've talked about how there's a couple different theories of truth. There's a coherency theory of truth, or a correspondential understanding of truth. And that correspondential understanding of truth is the way that most people understand truth, or what we would call facts, per se. That you make a truth claim, and does that truth claim then correspond to reality? Then that concept would relate to a whole different series of methodologies of trying to extract knowledge from the world. So the scientific method, empiricism, anything like that, induction. This is all going to be wrapped up in a correspondential theory of truth. However, once we start getting at a larger abstract understanding of paradigms, this is what Kant was talking about with his transcendental idealism, and really him kind of taking the floor out from underneath David Hume during their debates. But we depend, when we start to do our Christian apologetics from a tag argument, transcendental argument for God, we depend on a coherentist definition of truth, meaning what understanding or what paradigm actually is more coherent and therefore more truthful. Because when we start talking about non-physical things, when we start talking about the laws of logic, number theory, mathematics, the law of identity, all these different things that induction or empiricism or the scientific method account or assumes, but can they account for it? Can they philosophically justify their use of these things? We would argue, of course, not, without the presupposition of God. So Therefore, I wanted to present what is the definition of coherentism. And that is, there are two distinct types of coherentism. One refers to the coherence theory of truth, which restricts truth sentences to those that cohere with some specified set of sentences. Someone's belief is true if and only if it is coherent with all or most of the other beliefs. Usually, coherence is taken to imply something stronger than mere consistency. Statements that are comprehensive and meet the requirements of Occam's razor are usually to be preferred. The second type of coherentism is the belief in the coherence theory of justification, an epistemological theory opposing foundationalism and offering a solution to the regress argument. In this epistemological capacity, it is a theory about how belief can be justified. And that is really where we're going to get into the tag argument, the transcendental argument for God, is that we're using coherence as a theory of justification. Of course, we're already assuming it as a theory of truth, but because once you get into the sort of transcendental, the transcendentals, the philosophical transcendentals, you're not working at a materialistic level, so using induction or the scientific method to prove something to be true isn't going to work. You can't prove the laws of logic with measurement and averages. That is essentially how science comes to know the world. So we would use what's called a coherence theory of justification, an epistemological theory opposing foundationalism. Now, what is it? What do we mean by foundational? We mean classical foundationalism. Again, we talked about Aristotle. This is something that we've referenced in previous videos, that Aristotle and the classical foundationalist model believes that we make truth statements on top of other statements, right? We figure out something to be true, and then from there, we can then make new truth claims. And so the foundationalist model is always building on top of each other, but we would argue, if that's the case, how you can't account for the things that you're using, meaning the laws of logic, numbers, all this stuff, for the first truth statement. And so before we even start the foundationalist project, though we don't disagree, but at an apologetical level, we would say, first, you need to account for your use of logic. How do you account, especially if you're an atheist and you believe that the physical materialistic universe is all that exists? It existed from the Big Bang, so we'll take 13.8 billion years ago is usually what they say. And then matter has been slowly evolving into more and more complex forms. This is tied to a sort of novelty theory, even a sort of like progress philosophy or process philosophy, like Alfred North Whitehead, where things are moving into more and more complex patterns, more and more novelty, novel forms of organization. So we go from simple bacteria to Homo sapiens sapiens, correct, from their worldview. However, if that is the case, two main questions arise from our standpoint. The first one being, if the world, the physical reality, the universe is continually changing, it's in ever flux, it's always, quote, evolving, then how can you ever make a truth statement? Because once you make a truth claim, would it not be the case then that claim would also be referencing a reality that's continually changing? So that wouldn't be what we would consider ultimately truth that stands throughout time. So that's where then we start to get into philosophical pragmatism and stuff like that. But the other one is, we would say, okay, if you believe only in a physical universe and you believe the physical universe is continually evolving, how then do you account for the use of the laws of logic, non-physical categories that somehow allow us to reach truer assessments and statements about reality? Of course, that's going to be a difficult one, and then they're going to really talk about the sort of, well, we have to assume that to be true, and then say, well, you're doing the same thing with your assumption of God. And then that's when we would refer back to this coherency theory of justification, is that, no, unfortunately, you, in your atheistic model, materialistic model, you can't, so you can assume the laws of logic, but then you also have to assume every other thing, where somebody in a sort of theistic model could just assume God, and then they would provide a framework that would allow a more of a justified understanding of those transcendentals. So that would be coherentism. Sorry to ramble a bit on that one. And so the next one I want to talk about is deconstructionism. We've talked about this multiple times. What is deconstructionism? Deconstructionism in regards to, we talked about Jacques Derrida, the 1960s French intellectual. He is the father of the philosophical school of deconstructionism. And we talked about how deconstructionism is really antagonistic to the metaphysical project of Western civilization, Greek philosophy, and then moving into Christianity. So what is deconstructionism? Well, it is a school and a set of methods of textual criticism aimed at understanding the assumptions and ideas that form the basis for thought and belief. Also called deconstruction, its central concern is a radical critique of the metaphysics of the Western philosophical tradition, in which it identifies a logocentrism. See, we talked about phallogocentrism. This is essential in Jacques Derrida's very famous book, Grammatology, in which the phallic, the male, dominated, the logocentric, the logos, the laws of logic, this belief in an objective reality, all the things tied with the presupposition of logos is detrimental. And so he identifies a logocentrism, or metaphysics of presence, which holds that speech thought, the logos, is a privileged ideal and self-present entity through which all discourse and meaning derive. This logocentrism is the primary target of deconstruction. And so, therefore, the school of deconstructionism is really about aiming at what they believe to be the central pillar of Christianity or Christendom or Western civilization, of which I pretty much agree. I do agree that the phallogocentrism is the central pillar. I think that a lot of people, especially young college kids, women, they get caught up, they can't really talk about these ideas at a sophisticated level, but they get indoctrinated through the 4 years in university, and they come out with a lot of critical theory. This is all going to be in relation to postmodernism, which deconstructionism is a dimension of the postmodern movement. And so postmodernism is also a term here that we're going to cover to really hammer out what exactly postmodernism is as well. But, unfortunately, a lot of people, they go through the university system and they assume a lot of this stuff. So like the deconstructionist school, the phallogocentrism, so you hear women then talking about the patriarchy and the problems of Christianity, or white European ancestry as being inherently racist, all this stuff. And so these are subtly tied to a more sophisticated understanding of what was going on in the academy in regards to something like deconstructionism, postmodernism, and then postmodernism is going to give rise to all these post ideas, post-structuralism, post-Marxism, and really lead to what we call critical theory, which came out of the Frankfurt School, which I'm sure some of you guys are going to be familiar with. So that is deconstructionism, and don't forget that is tied to Jacques Derrida, the French intellectual of the 1960s, very famous in the 1960s, and he was the father of that philosophical school. And so from deconstructionism, we're going to move to dialectical materialism. Now, why did I choose dialectical materialism? I chose this because of people always talking about communism. Okay, well, we a lot of people feel like, or they do, have a general understanding of communism, but I think what is more important to know is what is called dialectical materialism, which is really at the heart of the sort of Marxist worldview. And so that's why I added that to the list today. So dialectical materialism is a philosophy of science and nature developed in Europe and based on the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marxist dialectics emphasizes the importance of real-world conditions in terms of class, labor, socioeconomic interactions. This is in contrast to the Hegelian dialectic. And so the Hegelian dialectic, for those, well, Hegelian dialectic, which emphasizes the observation that contradictions in material phenomenon could be resolved by analyzing them and synthesizing a solution while retaining their essence. Marx supposed that resolutions to such material conditions laced with contradictions could be in new forms of social organization. And so a few things that I want to say on this topic before moving on is Hegelian dialectic, that is the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I'm sure some of you guys are going to already be familiar with Hegel and his understanding of the Hegelian dialectic. And so, therefore, it always results in a sort of synthesizing. And that is also referred to as the problem-reaction-solution. And so those of you who are a little bit more conspiratorial-minded out there might use that framework in terms of how various events in society are orchestrated to manipulate society, that those that have power, we're talking about at the sort of higher levels, not the general society, they create problems to have an already determined reaction to that, funnel those people into that reaction, and then provide the same solution to the problem that they created. COVID-19 might be one of those. I won't go down that rabbit hole just for time, but that is dialectical materialism, and this is really an assumption that a lot of young people have, right? And we've talked about in regards to Christian theology, Orthodox theology, and how we're always trying to get out of the problem of dialectics. These dialectics, the dialectical materialism, the Hegelian dialectics, these kind of plague Western philosophy. And so how do we get out of these dialectical tensions is a serious question that a lot of people are trying to answer. And in Orthodox theology, one of the beautiful aspects of it is its movement typically towards a triune understanding. So it's not mono, it's not dia, it's not one or two, but it's triune. And so when we look at anthropology, nous, body, soul, things like that, we see threes appear. And so this is one way in which we argue that, of course, we use revealed scripture to talk about the Trinitarian understanding of God, but then the necessity of threes in general. And so when we look at a sort of a geometric understanding that triangles are the strongest shape, correct? So we see that in terms of structure, somehow structure, things are stronger in threes. And we would say this is sort of a semiotic, this is symbolic of a larger reality, or fractal or correspondential, if you will, something of that nature. So that is dialectical materialism. And the next term, very popular theological term that I've used, I'm sure most of you guys are probably already familiar with, so I don't mean to be speaking down to you or anything like that, but ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is an important theological term that I think everybody needs to know what it means and how to use it. And that's really the point of today's video, is to provide definitions for these words so we can become more competent and use these terms in our discussions with other people or with scholars or for debating or anything like that. So ecclesiology is the study of the Christian church, the origins of Christianity, its relationship to Jesus, its role in salvation, its polity, its discipline, its destiny, and its leadership. In its early history, one of the church's primary ecclesiological issues had to do with the status of Gentile members in what had been essentially a Jewish sect. So this would refer back then to the first council of our tradition, the Council of Jerusalem, led by James the Just, Bishop of Jerusalem, brother of Christ. So that whole council had to do with the sort of status of Gentiles, maintaining certain dietary practices, the practice of circumcision, all this stuff. And they ruled that, no, Christ was the ending of the distinction between Jew and Gentile. So I just wanted to throw that in there. But that was what that was referring to it. And so in regards to ecclesiology, it later contended that with such questions as whether it was to be governed by a council of presbyters or a single bishop, and how much authority the Bishop of Rome had over other major bishops, or the role of the church in the world, whether salvation was possible outside the institution of the church, the relationship of the church and the state, and questions of theology and liturgy and other issues. Now, of course, we as Orthodox certainly have a different understanding of the Bishop of Rome compared to Catholics, who would refer to that occupier as the Pope. Now, we understood the Pope, or the term Pope, as more of an honorific term, historically speaking, and so we don't recognize the existence of the papacy in the first millennium. In regards to traditional Orthodox ecclesiology, we understand, again, this is why the seven councils are so important, because it was understood to be governed by a synodal structure, meaning the bishops of all these different places, the bishops would come together. The bishops of Antioch, of Alexandria, of Rome would come together, and they would make decisions and be led by the Spirit to make those decisions wisely. So certainly later, the status of the Bishop of Rome definitely became a controversial issue in regards to Christian ecclesiology. So that's ecclesiology. The next term that we are going to be cover, again, you guys probably are already going to be familiar with this one, but epistemology. I say this all the time. Again, most of you guys, I'm sure, are already familiar with these terms. Epistemology, a term first used by the Scottish philosopher James Frederick Ferrier to describe the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature and scope of knowledge. It is also referred to as the theory of knowledge. Put concisely, it is the study of knowledge and justified belief. It questions what knowledge is and how it can be acquired, and the extent to which knowledge pertinent to any given subject or entity can be acquired. Much of the debate in this field has focused on the philosophical analysis of the nature of knowledge and how it relates to connected notions such as truth, belief, and justification. The term was probably first introduced in Ferrier's Institutes of Metaphysics, the Theory of Knowing and Being, 1854. So we're looking at even though this this branch of philosophy, like how do we know the world, we would say this has been since the ancient Greeks. But it is interesting from what I was looking into that they claim that the English term, because episteme, these are all the Greek words that it actually comes from. Ology comes from logos, right? But that its first use in English was actually in 1854, so the 19th century. That's pretty recent. So that is the term epistemology, which, again, I'm sure most of you guys already knew. So the next term are we good here? Are we still we still going? It looks like there's been a little bit of a lag here on the okay. Can you guys still see me and hear me? Is everything good? It looks like things are a little bit frozen or hectic. So is everything going all right? It looks like things are lagging a bit pretty significantly right now. Anyways, we will just move on through. Guys, let me know in the chat if you're not able to if you'll not be able to hear me. So okay. So it looks like we are trying to get back here. Okay. So I think we're back online here. Again, if you guys can, don't forget to smash that like button. Would greatly appreciate that. Oh, sound is good. Okay. I don't know why it is lagging right now. It's showing OBS is good. And yeah, okay, so it looks like maybe we're coming back right now, so no worries. Here we go. Let's just continue on with where we were. So we were discussing the next term after epistemology, and that is eschatology. Eschatology. And eschatological understandings. I think this is a very important theological term, eschatology. Again, I'm sure most of you guys may already be familiar. Some of you may have heard the term, may know that it has to do with the sort of end times or something of that nature, or the last thing. But it'll be helpful to give a more systematic definition as to what is eschatology. And so it is a part of theology concerned with the final events of history, or the ultimate destiny of humanity. This concept is commonly referred to as the end of the world, or end times. The word arises from the Greek eskastos, meaning last, and logi, meaning, that comes from logos, by the way, that's just the study of, and first appeared in English around 1844. So basically 10 years before the term epistemology arose in the English vernacular. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines eschatology as that part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul and of humankind. And so within Christianity, there are different forms of eschatology, or eschatological theories of history. So just to name a couple, you could think of something more apocalyptic, or apocalypticism, versus millenarianism. And so millenarianism as opposed to apocalypticism. So apocalypticism tends to see the end times as going to be embodied by a lot of destruction, a lot of chaos, potentially a lot of death, things of this nature, whereas millenarianism, when they look at the eschatological ending of history, they see it as very hopeful, and so somehow the ending of history transitions to something very beautiful. So there's two very different understandings, and these both exist within Christian theology. Millenarianism and apocalypticism both would be deemed sort of eschatological theories of history. And so eschatology is a very important term, and that's why I included it on today's list. So eschatology. The next one is something that we've all heard and may use, but again, it's always useful to have the exact definition, and that is existentialism. Existentialism. What are we talking about? Are we talking about Jean-Paul Sartre? No, well, could be, but we're talking about the philosophical movement that views human existence as having a set of underlying themes and characteristics, such as anxiety, dread, freedom, awareness of death, and consciousness of existing, that are primary. That is, they cannot be reduced to or explained by a natural scientific approach, or any approach that attempts to detach itself from or rise above these themes. And so we talk about being existential, or that is a very existentialist idea and things like that. And so again, this has to do with because of our, well, from a theological point of view, because we are made in the image of God, we're able to see and understand various things that other people may not, or other entities that for example, on this planet, right, we sort of have a unique ontology. Ontology is another word we'll be going over today. But that given our unique cognitive abilities, that we actually have anxiety and dread and freedom and awareness of this brevity of the thing we call life, and that death is coming for us, right? Our whole theology is about the conquering of death as Christians. So existentialism is a very, very prominent idea, an important school of philosophy. And so knowing what that term means and being able to use that again competently, I think, is extremely important if we're going to be diving into theological and philosophical debates. So that is existentialism. The next one is fallibilism, the doctrine that absolute certainty about knowledge is impossible, or at least that all claims to knowledge could, in principle, be mistaken as a formal doctrine. It is most strongly associated with Charles Sanders Peirce. I wonder how many of you guys actually know who Charles Sanders Peirce is. He is an important, actually an important figure. He is a major, actually, American scholars. So when we think of the philosophical school of pragmatism, which is sort of birthed here in America, it's one of America's few contributions to the field of philosophy in regards to major contributions. And so that was kind of started by Charles Sanders Peirce and William James. William James, I'm sure you guys have heard of. He has The Varieties of Religious Experience, his very famous book, where he argues for a sort of definition of religion that's much more experiential. Basically, God is that ultimate value that man relates to based on his sort of radical, open experiences he has in his life. I believe William James did a little nitrous oxide. I believe that is what it was, but he had a sort of a mystical experience, if you will, and so that's how he came up with his very phenomenological definition of religion. But Charles Sanders Peirce is a very important person, especially in the field of semiotics and the philosophical school of pragmatism, and he is an American. So Charles Sanders Peirce, we're talking about fallibilism, who used it in his attack on foundationalism. Okay, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about fallibilism, the doctrine that absolute certainty about knowledge is impossible. Okay, absolute certainty about knowledge is impossible. Now, Charles Sanders Peirce, one of the founders of the school of pragmatism, which is going to fall in line with these understandings that we actually cannot know ultimately the world in and of itself. Therefore, they believe much more in a sort of consequentialism, but utilitarianism. We'll get to that point. I actually have pragmatism as one of the terms that we're going to be discussing, but he uses this fallibilism to attack foundationalism. Now, we've already discussed what foundationalism. This is this idea that's tied to theories of the correspondential understanding of truth that somehow we can build on top and top and top of these absolute or these more certain forms of knowledge about the world. He is attacking that idea. And so, unlike skepticism, fallibilism does not imply the need for humans to abandon their knowledge. Humans need not have logically conclusive justifications for what they know. Rather, it is an admission that because empirical knowledge can be revised by further observation, all knowledge, excepting that which is axiomatically true, such as mathematical or logical knowledge, exists in a constant state of flux. So, we see how presuppositions then begin to flow onto themselves, and that this theory of knowledge being in a constant state of flux closely mimics and mirrors the more materialistic and even, if you will, sort of Darwinian understandings of matter itself continually being in flux, right? We've talked about Heraclitus in previous videos, the weeping philosopher, right? That all is in flux, all flows, pantere in the Greek, that you never step in the same river twice. So we see these ideas coalescing in different ways in this concept called fallibilism, and I think it was worth knowing, and that's why, again, I added this to our list today. And so the next term is fatalism. Fatalism. What is fatalism? I'm sure you guys have heard it being used before, but what exactly does it mean? Hold on, just lost my list. There we go. Fatalism is the view that human deliberation and actions are pointless and ineffectual in determining events because whatever will be, will be. One ancient argument called the ideal argument went like this. If it is fated for you to recover from your illness, then you will recover whether you call a doctor or not. Likewise, if you are fated not to recover, you will not do so even if you call a doctor. So calling a doctor makes no difference. Arguments like this are usually rejected even by casual determinists who may say that it may be determined that only a doctor can cure you. So, interesting idea. And I think that some people fall into this. Again, I'm not saying that they're totally conscientious of it, but some people, and it's just their presuppositions, I think may fall into this realm of thought in terms of a fatalism, that whatever will be, and that there's nothing you can do to change it. So, by the way, guys, please smash that like, hit the like button, and if you have any questions, I will be taking some super chats at the end of this, so if you'd like, we can go over some questions. So if that is something you'd be interested in, feel free to throw in a super chat. We can talk about things, whatever questions you may have. So that was fatalism, and the next term that we're going to be going over is called foundationalism. And again, we've already hammered home what exactly foundationalism is. We've talked about coherency theory, then we've talked about these various ideals that are antagonistic to foundationalism, like the fallibilism of Charles Sanders Peirce, related to the school of pragmatism. And mind you, just so you guys know, I'm sure some of you already do, saying somebody is being pragmatic is not the same thing as the pragmatist school in philosophy. Now, there is a little bit of overlap in the way we use those terms, but these are not the same thing. So to say, oh, well, he just has a very pragmatic approach to things, that's not saying that whoever you're talking about is a pragmatist per se. Pragmatism is something very different. Again, we will get to that. But foundationalism, right, is any justification or knowledge theory in epistemology that holds that beliefs are justified, known when they're based on basic beliefs, also called foundational beliefs. Basic beliefs are beliefs that are self-justifying or self-evident and don't need to be justified by other beliefs. Basic beliefs provide justificatory support to other beliefs, which can in turn support further derivative beliefs. Foundational. So basically all we're talking about there is this idea that we can stack truth claims onto each other, usually through induction. So again, just to rehash things we've talked about in previous videos, induction to deduction was the sort of epistemological model of Aristotle, as opposed to the Platonic model. So if we look into Plato, he began with what we would call, to use Kantian terms, an a priori presupposition of reality, like the ideal of forms, the realm of the ideas, the logos, if you will, the demiurgic logos for Plato. So he begins with a priori understandings of reality and then deduces ideas from there. That is the Platonic approach, as opposed to the Aristotelian approach, who uses induction. And that inductive approach is built upon what we call foundationalism, this idea that truth claims stack on top of each other over and over and over, and that's how we build our body of knowledge. And that's basically what was just being said there. That foundationalists hold that basic beliefs are justified by mental events or states, such as experiences, that do not constitute beliefs. These are called non-doxatic mental states, or that they simply are not the type of thing that can or needs to be justified. And so I'm sure you guys, most of you probably already have a grasp on what is foundationalism. And so from our critique, the way we would critique a foundationalist is that, okay, we, as say, you guys are fans of the J. Dyer's apologetic approach, using the transcendental argument for God, the tag approach. And so what you're doing then is, if you're up against anybody working off a foundationalist model, so that would include anybody working off a sort of natural theology or an atheist, right? Both those people, whether they're a Protestant or a Muslim or an outright atheist or an agnostic, they're all working off the same paradigm of foundationalism. And so what you do then is critique their ability to even begin with foundationalism, right? So if we're going to critique Aristotle, we're critiquing his ability to begin with induction itself without God, because how can you begin to assume, like, the laws of identity, the laws of logic, number theory, all this stuff? So just FYI, throwing that in there to give context to everything. Next term that I wanted to discuss with you guys is hedonism. Hedonism. Now, I know you guys are probably already familiar with this term and you know exactly what it means, but it's used quite a bit. I've talked about it previously and thought it would be useful to discuss here. And that is the ethical view that pleasure is the greatest good, and that pleasure should be the standard in deciding which course of action to pursue. Hedonism is usually associated with a more physical, egoistic, or unrefined definition of pleasure than that found in the related doctrine of utilitarianism. The term may also refer to the descriptive view that people are primarily motivated by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Now, hedonism, this would also be tied to the Epicurean school of philosophy. So Epicurus was very much interested in a sort of hedonistic understanding. Now, his hedonism certainly wouldn't be the hedonism we find in 2020, where all forms of toleration must be tolerated, no matter what it is. Again, we're seeing the normalization of pedophilia and very aberrant forms of sexuality. So Epicurus was not advocating for all types of pleasure, but pleasure that moves you towards the good. So pleasure like having deep, important, and useful conversations with your friends, spending time with friends and family, that type of thing. So his hedonism, it's still hedonism. I mean, anybody looks up his philosophy, you're still going to get the hedonism, but it's not so degenerate, if you will. So next term is humanism. Humanism. Now, we use this term all the time. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it, but what exactly is humanism? And it is a philosophical stance that emphasizes the value and agency of human beings, individually and collectively. The meaning of the term humanism has fluctuated according to the successive intellectual movements which have identified with it. Generally, however, humanism refers to a perspective that affirms some notion of human freedom and progress. It views humans as solely responsible for the promotion and development of individuals and emphasizes a concern for humans in relation to the world. And so humanism is, I would say, often the sort of default sort of position we find a lot of people in the modern world. Now, hold on. I wanted to see if, nope. Okay. Never mind. So humanism now is often associated with a sort of secularism. It's sort of it's a way to talk about the role and status or privileged status of humanity outside of any sort of theistic understanding. So humanism, though originally tied with, you could say, sort of theological understandings, in its more modern or contemporary context, I should say, not modern, but contemporary context, it's usually when somebody says they're a humanist, it almost signifies that they're part of a sort of secular, potentially atheistic or agnostic understanding of God, and therefore when they refer to ultimate values, they're going to refer to the sort of privileged agency of human beings. And so, therefore, human beings need to really care about other human beings. And so I say a humanistic ethic then runs under things like global climate change, right? That we have to be so concerned with the planet and with other people and all this stuff. So, yeah, that's humanism. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. And so because of that, I wanted to tie that into the next definition, which is humanistic naturalism. It's something a little bit different. And that is the belief that human beings, as well as plants and animals, are divine and intricate extensions of nature. Followers share a mutual respect for things created directly by nature, even though life must feed upon life for continuance. While most believers are able to adapt to modern change, naturalists prefer the fair exchange of resources, as was in the case of former agricultural and hunter-gatherer societies. Industry and technology are an exact opposition to naturalism. And so there's something really interesting here with the humanistic naturalism, I think, in regards to when you begin the first half of this definition. I think what immediately comes to mind, or what could potentially, or at least for me, I'll just speak for myself, is a sort of 1960s hippie, right? That the belief that human beings, as well as plants and animals, are divine and intricate extensions of nature, the sort of pantheistic spiritual yearnings of the counterculture in the 1960s. However, when we come down to the very last sentence there, industry and technology are an exact opposition to naturalism, I find that so interesting because I would say that, well, of course, Silicon Valley and stuff, all that stuff is deeply tied to the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s, the whole counterculture of the 1960s and whatnot, which is extremely industrial and technological. And so when we look at then the power shift or the dynamic shift in Western nations, or just take America generally speaking, and we see the 1960s counterculture become antagonistic and in opposition to the hegemony of Protestant Christianity, that those traditional Christian norms within America. I think it's so interesting that now how they're tied to big tech, big industry, big technology, surveillance, the centralization of power, and all these things, that what began out of some of these more potentially humanistic or even naturalistic yearnings, see how they've been shaped, molded, and what they've turned into. So I think that's interesting, and that was a term that I wanted to share. The next one, again, all you guys are probably familiar with, that is individualism. Individualism. What is individualism? Well, it just means that everybody's an individual. Well, basically. Individualism in political philosophy, the view that rights or well-being of individuals are to be protected rather than the rights or well-being of groups such as nations or state ideologies as communism or democracy, or religious communities such as Christendom. Individualism is often associated with classical liberalism and opposed to the various sorts of communalism and nationalism. And so the opposition to communalism and nationalism, I think, is really sort of here's an interesting take. Something I've been thinking about is we see the rise of the populist movements, politically speaking, across the world right now. So if we look at the United States and we see right now, Bernie Sanders was sort of the representative candidate of the populist left, which I would say would be much more in line with that communal aspect, right? I mean, we could talk about communism or socialism or, however you want to frame that. But those are going to be wrapped up in a communalistic understanding of society and identity, as opposed to the emphasis on individualism. And so because individualism is so rooted within that classical liberal worldview, and that post-Enlightenment classical liberalism shaped certainly America, we see how consumerism, how America has individualized everybody to a point where they almost don't have collective power and stuff like that. And so the loss of the community, the loss of the communal structure, I think is representative of how technology has been used to emphasize and individualize or atomize people further and further and further. And so I thought it's so interesting when we look at this, that individualism is in opposition to what's called communalism and nationalism. And what we see in this country is the political populist right is in favor of nationalism. And then we see the populist left in favor of communalism. And so where is the enfavorment of the individualism? Well, in the American context, I'd say that'd probably be rooted within the libertarians who really still hold to a lot of those classical liberal worldviews and presuppositions and understanding. So I just thought that was really interesting, that we kind of know what individualism is, and then we begin to view society from the individualistic perspective, and then how that's in opposition to communalism and nationalism. Now, in regards to theology, I think it's also worth noting that within Christian theology, again, we've talked about this from an Orthodox perspective over and over, how individualism is it is not the same thing as personhood, theologically speaking, and how we get personhood from God. So I think that's important because of where Protestantism and post-Enlightenment thought went with the individualistic and the classical liberal ideas. So enough of that. So the next term that I wanted to talk to you guys about, that I've already mentioned in this stream, is inductivism. Now, I've talked about induction. I talked about Aristotle, and his epistemological methodology went from induction to deduction. That's how he would, that was sort of his movement in regards to how he would understand the world, how he would understand reality. And so inductivism, the philosophy that holds that scientific research is guided by the various observations and data produced by previous science experiments. In other words, that science progresses in a direction that has prior experimental data, right? Again, induction, because induction is going to be tied to what we already established as foundationalism. These are not the same thing, but they're they're certainly intricately related. And so inductivism, so what that's talking about is observations and data produced by previous science experiments. Again, in other words, that science progresses in a direction that has prior experimental data, meaning we know something and then we can build and build and build. That's that foundationalist model. Inductivism is doing that exact thing through the process of induction, through induction. So it exists both in a classical naive version, which has been highly influential, and in various more sophisticated versions. The naive versions, which trace back to thinkers such as David Hume, says that general statements, theories have to be based on empirical observations, which are subsequently generalized into statements that can be regarded as true or probably true. So that is inductivism. Now, the next one that I wanted to talk about is logical positivism. Now, I thought, again, we talk about the laws of logic, again, our sort of transcendental argument for God and everything. So I thought it'd be useful to begin to discuss what is the school of logical positivism. This is a very important and influential school of philosophy, especially in the 20th century. So what exactly is logical positivism? Well, it's a philosophy of science originating in the Vienna Circle in the 1920s, which holds that philosophy should aspire to the same sort of rigor as science. Why? Because that scientific structure is so useful, right, for factual understandings of reality. Well, we need that same rigor for our philosophical analysis. And so logical positivism asserts that philosophy should provide strict criteria for judging sentences to be true, false, and meaningless. Although the logical positivist held a wide range of beliefs on many matters, they all shared an interest in science and deep skepticism of the theological and the metaphysical. And so this is one of the reasons why I highlighted this term, is because, for example, like my research project has a lot to do with tracing the trajectory of metaphysical analysis and work post-Kant into the contemporary period. And so it tends to fall on Christian theologians and apologists to advocate for metaphysics, the general nature, the general trend within philosophy, given this scientific, again, like the logical positivism, this idea that somehow science is the arbiter of truth or close to, outside mathematics and maybe the laws of logic, that they wanted to do away with the field of metaphysics, which, again, that is one of the definitions that we will be getting to as well. So continuing on, following Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now, I don't know if you guys have read his Tractatus. Very, very important individual in regards to the field of the philosophy of language. Ludwig Wittgenstein. Many subscribe to the correspondence theory of truth. Right, we talked about this earlier with the in opposition to the coherency theory. So the correspondential theory of truth, right? It's tied to what we've already called as foundationalism. It's tied to what we already talked to as inductivism. So the correspondence theory of truth, although some believed in coherentism, we've already discussed that, they believed that all knowledge should be based on logical inference from simple protocol sentences grounded in observable facts. Hence, many supported forms of realism, materialism, philosophical naturalism, and empiricism. And so logical positivism is a important field or school of philosophy that I think, again, we all need to be at least aware of to some degree or another. The next term is in opposition to that funny little term we began with called antinomialism, and that this is legalism. And legalism, in the Western sense, is an approach to the analysis of legal questions characterized by abstract logical reasoning focused on the applicable legal text, such as a constitution, legalization, or case law, rather than the social, economic, or political context. Legalism has occurred in has occurred both in civil and common law traditions. Legalism may endorse the notion that the pre-existing body of authoritative legal materials already contains a uniquely predetermined right answer to any legal problem that may arise. In legalism, the task of the judge is to ascertain the answer to a legal question mechanically. And so the legalistic understanding of society, I think, that dimension, that element, exudes itself nicely in the American context within our court system, the sort of juridical branch of our government. So we have, the president, we have the sort of oligarchical forms in regards to the Senate and the House, or the House being more of a representation of the people, the Senate being sort of the oligarchical representation, the executive branch and the president being sort of the monarchical representation, and then the sort of juridical understanding. I think it's sort of an expression of this legalistic understanding that was certainly present in much of post-Enlightenment thinking, stuff like that. So next term, very important term, as I've already mentioned. What is metaphysics? Metaphysics. Okay, so it's metaphysics. So it's the things that are meta, not entirely physical. Is that what it is? Well, metaphysics is a very important, like I said, branch in philosophy that's pretty much been attempted to be done away with. Now, metaphysics is a traditional branch of philosophy concerned with explaining the fundamental nature of being in the world that encompasses it. Although the term is not easily defined, traditionally, metaphysics attempts to answer two basic questions in the broadest possible terms. Ultimately, what is there, and what is it like? A person who studies metaphysics is called a metaphysician. The metaphysician attempts to clarify the fundamental notions by which people understand the world, for example, given, e.g., existence, objects and their properties, space and time, cause and effect, and possibility. So metaphysics was considered for quite a long time to be the crown of knowledge. It was the sort of science of knowledge. It was the crown jewel. And so a central branch of metaphysics is ontology, the investigation into the basic categories of being and how they relate to each other. Another central branch of metaphysics is cosmology, the study of the origin, fundamental structure, nature, and dynamics of the universe. Some include epistemology as another central focus of metaphysics, but other philosophers question this. Now, I would include epistemology within a metaphysics, and that's why this is, again, why metaphysics was deemed to be such an important field of study that, again, has pretty much done away with, generally speaking, outside more religious circles within philosophy and theology. So, so metaphysics, very, very important field of study, really kind of going to the wayside, although I think it's going to make a comeback because of sort of presuppositional attacks. Like, you can't really, and this is, I have this great book, I don't have it around me that I'm reading. It's actually on metaphysics. It's from Parmenides to Levinas. And so it's this great kind of vast overview of sort of metaphysical developments and conversations in philosophy from, again, Parmenides all the way up to Levinas. And so it was talking about, again, how metaphysics is the sort of crown jewel, and how metaphysics, the author argues in his book, giving this vast overview of the history of metaphysics, that you can't not do metaphysics. As soon as you start making truth claims, as soon as you start talking about being, as soon as you enter any sort of ontology, that you are already sort of wrapped into a presupposition of metaphysics. I totally agree with that, and I think that's why metaphysics really fits nicely with the tag approach to apologetics, the transcendental argument for God, because it is presuppositional. And so our next term is, hold on, let me make sure everything's going good in the chat. Looks like everything's going pretty good. All right. Continuing on. So modernism needs to be defined because we talk about postmodernism, right? And so postmodernism is actually a term that's going to be on this list that we will eventually get to. But to know what postmodernism is, you're going to need to know what modernism is to know that we're beyond it. And so modernism is the series of reforming cultural movements in art and architecture, music, literature, and the applied arts, which emerged roughly in the period between 1884 and 1914. Modernism affirms the power of human beings to create, improve, and reshape their environments with the aid of scientific knowledge, technology, and practical experimentation. Again, mind you, the Industrial Revolution and all this stuff is tied to the modernist, or tied to modernism. Not that it's one and the same thing, but you could see how the idea that scientific knowledge, technology, and practical experimentation can aid in the creation, improvement, and reshaping of human environments, that is tightly tied to the rise of industrialism. And the term covers many political, cultural, and artistic movements rooted in the changes in Western society at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. So modernism, so this is what postmodernism is in opposition to. Now, even though we might, as more traditional Christians, not be as excited about sort of some of the modernist presuppositions, modernism itself, the reason why postmodernism doesn't like modernism is because scientific knowledge, technology, practical experimentation is still rooted in that logocentric worldview that they don't like. Because that logocentric worldview is going to be tied to then presuppositions that might privilege masculinity in the world. And so it is funny then how we see the opposition to the patriarchal system, like second, third wave feminism, actually lead to the masculinization of the feminine. And therefore, we've also seen the feminization of the masculine. So talked about that with Dr. Mo in regards to testosterone levels and all that, how men in the contemporary period are exuding quite low levels of testosterone, shockingly low levels of testosterone and fertility, that men in their prime are nowhere near the testosterone levels they should be, or at least in comparison to men, say, 40 years ago. Again, you've heard me say this over and over again, but I think it's worth mentioning because it's so shocking that Dr. Mo talked about in one of his papers that he was referencing. Some of the research has showed that testosterone levels of a man that was 60 years old in the 1980s, so that's 40 years ago, guys, 1980s, was higher than in, I think the paper was written in like 2016, 2015, was higher than men in their 20s, prime in their 20s, that their testosterone levels were drastically lower than that of a 60-year-old man in the 1980s. Now, mind you, testosterone level begins to go down after the age of 30, generally speaking. Of course, that's different for every person, how you maintain your physique, your body, the things you eat, stuff like that. But very, very problematic. And so when we see the feminization of Western civilization, when we see the degradation of Western culture, when we see the cucking, if you will, I think that's certainly tied with the dropping in testosterone levels amongst men, generally speaking. So anyways, that was a digression. I will come back to topic and discuss the next term, mysticism. Mysticism. Now, I know you guys probably already know what mysticism is. As Orthodox, we refer to Orthodoxy as the mystical church within Christianity, right? Well, that will make a little bit more sense after reading this definition. And so mysticism is the pursuit of achieving communion, identity with, or conscious awareness of ultimate reality, the divinity, spiritual truth, or God through direct experience, intuition, or insight. Traditions may include a belief in the literal existence of dimensional realities beyond empirical perception, or a belief that a true human perception of the world goes beyond current logical reasoning or intellectual comprehension. So, mysticism, both of the ways in which I think it is used in this definition apply to the Orthodox Church. What do I mean? Well, sometimes it's referred to how Catholicism and Protestantism is so interested in sort of definitional understandings. They're always trying to define things. You know, this is where even the doctrine of dang, I'm having a brain fart right now. What is it? Where the Eucharist, the Catholic doctrine for the transformation of the Eucharist, I'm having a brain fart. You guys know what I'm talking about. But anyways, how Western forms of Christianity come branching out of the Latin tradition are very much interested in sort of analytical, definitional understanding, stuff like that. And whereas the Orthodox, the Eastern Church says, we don't know. We don't know how God was, we don't know how Jesus was fully God and fully man. That's a mystery. That's a mystery. And so that is one way in which the Orthodox Church is described as the mystical church. But also, the first part of this definition, I think, is true because it's only in the Orthodox Church we have the doctrine of theosis. And so theosis being the whole point of creation itself, the church is very mystical because the whole point of being a human is to attain a synergistic union with the divine nature. This is theosis. This is the synergizing of human nature with divine nature by following the will of God and emulating our icon, Jesus Christ. So both of these are very interesting, both these aspects to this definition, and I think, again, both of them apply nicely to orthodoxy. So the next term we'll be talking about is naturalism. Naturalism. And I think this is an important term. We talk about this, this idea has sort of been referenced in multiple videos. And so what exactly is natural? What do people mean when they talk about naturalistic schools of philosophy or this or that? Well, naturalism is any of several philosophical stances, typically those descended from materialism and pragmatism. Again, we'll get to pragmatism here in a few. That do not distinguish the supernatural, including strange entities like non-natural values and universals as they are commonly conceived, from nature. Naturalism does not necessarily claim that phenomena or hypotheses commonly labeled as supernatural do not exist or are wrong, but insists that all phenomena and hypotheses can be studied by the same methods, and therefore anything considered supernatural is either non-existent, unknowable, or inherently different to the natural phenomena or hypotheses. And so naturalism, this is more about a sort of understanding of causality itself, right? So the philosophical school of naturalism is looking for naturalistic explanations of the world, excluding any sort of supernatural or mystical understanding or explanation. So that's why naturalism is so much tied to empiricism, it's so much tied to materialism, it's so much tied to radical positivism, things like that. Those are, again, all different kind of schools of thought. And of course, pragmatism. And pragmatism, again, is the major contribution of the American philosophical community to the field of philosophy itself. I mean, not that there hadn't been great American philosophers over time. We're talking about America actually creating new schools of thought. Pragmatism is usually considered the main one. So that was naturalism. And our next one is nihilism, or nihilism, however you want to pronounce that. So nihilism is the philosophical view that the world, and especially human existence, is without meaning, purpose, comprehensible truth, or essential value. It is more often a charge leveled against a particular idea than a position to which someone is overtly subscribed. I would agree with that to a degree. I would agree to a degree. But anyways, movements such as the Dada movement in art. So I think Dada is the early 20th century. I can't remember if it touched the very end of the 19th century or not. But the Dada movement, I'm pretty sure Dada was entirely 20th century. 1920s, I believe, is where it came out of. And then deconstructionism. We've already talked about deconstructionism, Jacques Derrida, how deconstruction is really in opposition to that logocentric understanding of Christendom, of Western civilization, of the privileging of the logos, right? And punk have been described as various observers as nihilist. Now, why would deconstructionism be considered nihilist? Well, because their attack on that logocentric presupposition of reality is really divorcing the potential for there being objective reality, for there being objective truth. And so that would be why people would level the accusation that deconstructionism would be a nihilistic. So which I would totally agree with. I mean, postmodernism, generally speaking, I would believe is entirely nihilistic. And so a lot of these worldviews that believe like in total subjectivity and relativism comes out of literary theory. So postmodernism, as we will get to, actually comes from literary critics. Well, even Derrida's deconstruction of the idea of presence, and their idea that there's infinite interpretations of a text, and that there actually is no presence behind the text. There is no intention of the author that must be understood to better understand the text, right? So if I write something, a postmodernist or a deconstructionist would say, okay, so pretend I write something out, or like maybe a paragraph or a book or something, and I have an intention that I put in all this, and I hope when people read it, they get what I'm trying to say. A postmodernist or a deconstructionist would say that's pointless. There is no presence behind the text, that whatever I glean from what you wrote is just as true as what you intended for me to glean. So you see then that there's infinite interpretations to a text, and no one interpretation is superior to another interpretation, even the author's interpretation or intention of what they were trying to write. That is what they believe. This then leads, you take that idea and expand that further just to reality itself, and then everybody has an interpretation, everybody has a point of view, and no point of view is superior to the other. That is basically where then you'd find yourself in a postmodern worldview. Anywho, next term is nominalism. And nominalism, this is a very important term. We talk about Platonism a lot, and we need to know what nominalism means. It is the opposition to Platonism. And so nominalism is the belief that universals or mental concepts have no objective reality, but exist only as words or names. Again, grasp that. That universals or mental concepts have no objective reality, but exist only as words or names. This school of thought is usually contrasted with Platonism. Now, why would it be contrasted with Platonism? Because Platonism is all about the realm of the ideal, of ideas, right? And so that Platonism is emphatic on the idea of forms. These are universals, right? Platonism is built on the concept of universals. And so that is why nominalism is usually contrasted or seen as antagonistic or oppositional to Platonism and the presuppositions and the philosophies of Plato. So there are at least two main versions of nominalism. One version denies the existence of universals, things that can be instantiated or exemplified by many particular things. Example given, strength, humanity. And the other version specifically denies the existence of abstract objects that do not exist in space and time. And so within a Christian context, one of the prominent people who would see, who would sort of represent the flourishing of the nominal worldview would be a William of Ockham, right? And I'm sure you guys have heard of Occam's razor, right? The attempt to not multiply not increase the possible explanation of something without necessity, right? That usually the simplest explanation is right. Something of that sort, that's sort of tied. Again, that's very paraphrased and reductionistic understanding of Occam's razor, but it's basically don't multiply without necessity possible explanations to a phenomenon. And so William of Ockham was a nominalist. And so if you wanted to look more into nominalistic understandings within a Christian framework, William of Ockham would be a great place to start. Next term that is important that you've heard me talk about and many other people talk about is ontology. What is ontology? We've talked about it over and over, and I'm always saying ontological and stuff like that. Well, ontology is the philosophical study of being. More broadly, it studies concepts that directly relate to being, in particular becoming, existence, reality, as well as all the basic categories of being and their relations. Traditionally listed as part of the major branch of philosophy known as metaphysics, again, we've already covered. Ontology often deals with questions concerning what entities exist or may be said to exist and how such entities may be grouped, related within a hierarchy, and subdivided according to similarities and differences. And so ontology in this sort of is tied to the study of being, and it is an extremely important term when discussing whether either theology or philosophy. So again, ontology, epistemology, these are a few of the terms that I would say are most important from my list that I'm presenting to you guys. Ontology is a term if you want to have more sophisticated and direct conversations with at a sort of academic or scholastic level. Knowing what ontology means is essential. You got to know the word and you be able to use ontology competently, for sure. So the next term that I want to talk to you guys about is panentheism. Panentheism. I've talked about panentheism. We generally all know what pantheism is. Pantheism is the idea that all of nature is alive. It all is divine, right? I would say this is a very common sort of New Age understanding that all the universe, the pantheistic idea that all of nature is divine. They worship goddesses, nature spirits, this type of stuff. Paganism. But there is also a little bit more sophisticated form of pantheism called panentheism. And even orthodoxy can be seen as a form of panentheism. Now, we would certainly differentiate ourselves from other worldviews that would talk about panentheism, but panentheism is the theological position that God is immanent within the universe, but also transcends it. It is distinguished from pantheism, which holds that God is synonymous with the material universe. I just said pantheism. So the whole idea when people talk about God being the universe, God being nature, or the universe wants the best for you, these are all sort of pantheistic understandings. In panentheism, God is viewed as creator and or animating force behind the universe and the source of universal morality. So we can totally get behind that, right? God as creator, animating force of reality through his will, and he is the source of universal morality. The term is closely associated with the logos of Greek philosophy and the works of Heraclitus, or I believe that's really just Heraclitus, which pervades the cosmos and whereby all things were made. So panentheism can take forms within traditions that we would actually oppose, but it is true that we as Orthodox, we as Christians can understand our worldview in a way as panentheistic. And we're also monotheistic, or that's because God has one essence, but then has three persons. So all this stuff, when you start to go a little bit deeper, you have to be more specific. You really have to clarify your terms and everything like that. So next term that I wanted to use or discuss is panpsychism. Panpsychism is really important because this is also a growing concept. Even in the academy, in regards to theories of mind, prominent scholars are even putting forth panpsychic understandings of the universe, meaning that the universe itself may have a mind. And so panpsychism is either the view that all parts of matter involve mind, or more holistic view that the whole universe is an organism that possesses a mind. And so you could look at somebody like a Rupert Sheldrake. There's a famous cosmologist and philosopher of mind. I think it's something Nagel. I want to say Thomas. I can't remember. You guys will have to fact check me. But he's written a book on a sort of apologetic for a panpsychic worldview. So the idea that the universe is an organism and possesses a mind. It is thus a stronger and more ambitious view than hylozoism, which holds only that all things are alive. And I would say even some people take on a hylozoism worldview. whether they're conscious of it or not. Again, kind of wrapped up in the New Age spirituality, stuff like that. You know what I mean? This is not to say that panpsychism believes that all matter is alive or even conscious, but rather that the constituent parts of matter are composed of some form of mind and are sentient. And so this this is a very interesting idea. Now, I don't know how much I agree with it, but it is worth knowing, and knowing that it's actually gaining steam within the academy. And it's just the term I was referring to in regards to the miraculous transformation of the Eucharist within Christian theology, that is transubstantiation. I see a couple of you guys were mentioning it in the chat. I wasn't even looking at the chat, but yeah, that's exactly. I had such a brain fart. I could not remember that term for a second. So just wanted to throw that out there. I know that was a bit of a digression again, but panpsychism, important term to know, important concept to grasp, and this is actually growing steam within theories of mind and cosmology. So very interesting stuff there. Now, next term we're going to discuss is Platonism. Now, we talk about Platonism. I refer to Platonism. You've heard people talk about Aristotelianism. All this. Well, what exactly is Platonism? Right? We talked about nominalism. Nominalism was the rejection of universals and sort of mental categories as being universal, and how nominalism was then in opposition to Platonism. Well, if that's the case, well, what exactly is Platonism? Well, Platonism is the philosophy of Plato and philosophical systems closely derived from it. Though contemporary Platonists do not necessarily accept all the doctrines of Plato, agreed, Platonism has a profound effect on Western thought. Platonism at least affirms the existence of abstract objects which are asserted to exist in a third realm distinct from both the sensible external world and the internal world of consciousness, and it is the opposite of nominalism. We've already talked about that. This can apply to properties, types, propositions, meanings, numbers, sets, truth, values, and so on. See abstract object theory. Philosophers who affirm the existence of abstract objects are sometimes called Platonists. Those who deny their existence are sometimes called nominalists. And so the idea of universals and stuff like that, of course, we root our worldview back in a sort of theological framework, but we can see that we as Christians certainly believe in universals and would agree with various concepts that would be deemed Platonic or related to Platonism. So knowing what Platonism is really doing. So again, Plato is talking about the realm of the ideal, ideas, forms, this type of thing, sort of metaphysical archetypes of reality, this type of stuff. So that is Platonism, and that is the general structure of how, again, Platonism is way more, if you want to get deeper into it, you need to read Plato, you need to know a little bit more about this stuff, what are the actual ideas of Plato. But Platonism, generally speaking, is all about the sort of the idea of universals and trying to account for these universals and describe them and understand them, stuff like that. So that is Platonism. Now we are moving on to a very important Christian theological term called pneumatology. Pneumatology. What is pneumatology? Pneumatology is the study of the Holy Spirit. Pneuma, spirit, logos, study. And so pneumatology refers to a particular discipline within Christian theology that focuses on the study of the Holy Spirit. The term is derived from the Greek word pneuma, which signifies breath or spirit, and metaphorically describes a non-material being or influence. The English term pneumatology comes from two Greek words, pneuma and logos, teaching or about. Pneumatology includes study of the person of the Holy Spirit and the works of the Holy Spirit. And so pneumatology, very important term within Christian theology that you should know. So pneumatology, Christology would be the other one. I didn't include Christology because that's sort of self-explanatory. It's the study of the person of Christ. So didn't really need to talk much about Christology. That's pretty self-explanatory. But I thought pneumatology was worth presenting because the Holy Spirit tends to be sort of the odd man out when talking about the Trinity, usually. So I actually took one of the theological courses I took at the GTU was on pneumatology and its development from sort of early Christianity to contemporary periods. And so looking at differences within Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and then eventually Protestantism and stuff like that. So pneumatology, very important term to know. Next term, as I promised we would get to eventually, it is postmodernism. And postmodernism is a philosophical movement characterized by the postmodern criticism and analysis of Western philosophy. Beginning as a critique of continental philosophy, it was heavily influenced by phenomenology. So phenomenology is sort of the study of experience itself, structuralism, and existentialism, and by the philosophers Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger. It was also influenced to some degree by Ludwig Wittgenstein. Later criticisms of analytical philosophy, or analytic philosophy. Within postmodern philosophy, there are numerous interrelated fields, including deconstruction, which we've already covered, and several fields beginning with the prefix post, such as post-structuralism, post-Marxism, post-feminism. In particular, postmodern philosophy was spawned a huge literature of critical theory. Yay, critical theory. Now, I know you guys, I'm sure, are sympathetic to my feelings towards critical theory. Critical theory comes out of the Frankfurt School and really is wrapped up in some of these Marxist ideas like dialectical materialism, stuff like that. But critical race theory, this is all tied to postmodern understandings, right, of white privilege, the inherent racism of white people, whiteness as a concept. Because, I mean, mind you, any sort of sophisticated analysis of European civilization would recognize that there's a multiplicity of racial and ethnic groups. You know, the Germanics are not the same as the Anglos, and the Franks are not the same as, the Tartars or the Slavs or all this stuff. But because they have a phenotype of having less melanin, critical theory then groups all of them in the large concept of whiteness, stuff like that. So, postmodernism is in opposition. It says that it was very critical to continental philosophy and Western philosophy, generally speaking. But remember when we were talking about modernism, what is modernism? And that was that whole concept that was developing in the late 19th century, early 20th century about humanity and their ability to reshape, create, and improve their sort of human environments through science, technology, and industry, and stuff like that. And so those concepts then are tied to that logocentrism, which is then being deconstructed by deconstructionism, which is an aspect of this postmodern tradition, okay? So it's important to know exactly what postmodern is, especially if you can go listen to old Jordan Peterson, talk about the postmoderns. But just knowing exactly what this means, I think, is really important. We talk about it all the time, so just need to know exactly what that is. Next definition that I wanted to talk about is pragmatism. Pragmatism. We've mentioned it over and over and over in this video today. It's come up multiple times, and I mentioned how this is the philosophical jewel of America. This is our major contribution to the field of philosophy, and it's one that it's interesting, but it certainly runs counter to my worldview. And so pragmatism is a philosophy that originated in the United States in the late 19th century, again, through the figures of Charles Sanders Peirce, who we mentioned with the idea of fallibilism, and with somebody like a William James, coming from the very famous James family, right? Henry James, his brother, the very famous author. They were the founding heads of the field of pragmatism. And so pragmatism is characterized by the insistence on consequences, right? I talked about consequentialism. Utility and practicality as vital components of meaning and truth. Okay. So this is a very important sentence to grasp and grok. Pragmatism is characterized by the insistence on consequences, utility, and practicality as the components of meaning and truth. So think about that from a theological or Christian worldview. Do we associate something to be true based on its consequences, its utility, and its practicality? Of course not. And so this is where then relativism, utilitarian understandings get leveled at pragmatism, because it's just pragmatism itself is wrapped up in that presupposition that knowledge itself, right? That we've talked about fallibilism from Charles Sanders Peirce, that he used fallibilism to level that at the foundationalist school. That's exactly what he's doing with pragmatism. He's just expanding that concept of fallibilism further, that even knowledge itself is continually changing. Therefore, we can't ultimately know reality in and of itself. That pragmatism absolutely believes in that. So because we can't know reality in and of itself, we shouldn't even assume that we can, and we should instead and focus on consequences, utility, and practicality for our understandings of meaning and truth. Pragmatism objects to the view that human concepts and intellect represent reality, and therefore stands in opposition to both formalist and rationalist schools of philosophy. Rather, pragmatism holds that it is only the struggle of intelligent organisms with the surrounding environment that theories acquire significance, and only with a theory's success in this struggle that it becomes true. And so my advisor during my undergraduate studies, Dr. Craig, a very important figure in my intellectual development, was a sort of conversational partner, helped me sharpen my own skills. He was a devout pragmatist, and he was very open about his approach to philosophy and epistemology, knowledge itself. But he was a pragmatist who was a religious studies scholar who wrote about ethics. And so he was an ethicist who wrote about ethics from a pragmatic worldview, from the pragmatist school. And so he was very much interested in the writings of John Dewey. So after Charles Sanders Peirce, after William James, you get somebody like a John Dewey, who's considered to be another American scholar, considered to be one of the leading figureheads of the pragmatist school. So moving on from there, we come to scholasticism, right? Anybody who's watched Dyer's videos, anybody who's watched some of my videos has heard me talk about scholasticism. And scholasticism is a school of philosophy taught by the academics of medieval universities, circa 1100 or 1500. Scholasticism attempted to reconcile the philosophy of the ancient classical philosophers with medieval Christian theology. The primary purpose of scholasticism was to find the answer to a question and resolve a contradiction. It is the most well-known in its application of medieval theology, but was applied to classical philosophy and other fields of study. It is not a philosophy or theology on its own, but a tool and method for learning that emphasizes dialectical reasoning. And it emphasized all that stuff because of its privileging of Aristotle. Now remember, much of Western Europe actually lost base with the Platonic writings, so they didn't have Plato, and that's why it reemerges in the Renaissance through the translation projects of Marsilio Ficino by the Medici, Cosimo de' Medici. So we get the Council of Florence during this time. We already talked about all this stuff. And so the reintroduction of Platonism into Western Europe really changed things. And so scholasticism was much more interested in a sort of Aristotelian approach. And scholasticism itself eventually led to natural theology. So somebody like a Bonaventure was in opposition to somebody like a Thomas Aquinas, who believed you could begin to, do theology or philosophy without beginning with God. So Bonaventure, even though he's Catholic, may have been more sympathetic to our sort of tag approach to apologetics, as opposed to Aquinas thought you could basically do natural theology. And because of that assumption, you can see why scholasticism eventually led to philosophy itself, right? Well, now we can make truth claims about the world. We don't even have to talk about God. We don't have to talk about our presuppositions, our religious presuppositions. And so we can see then how the philosophy then not being rooted within God eventually leads to all these things. Eventually, we get well, I mean, like it says circa 1100 to 1500. So 1517, we get the Protestant Reformation, and soon the Enlightenment is to come. So interesting stuff there. That is scholasticism. Another very important term, guys. Mark this one down. Like I said, we've talked about epistemology, ontology, pneumatology. These are very important terms for any Christian to know. Another one is soteriology. Soteriology is all about the study of salvation. And so this is a religious studies term, although we use this within a Christian theological context. Soteriology is a study of religious doctrines of salvation. Salvation theory occupies a place of special significance in many religions. In the academic field of religious study, soteriology is understood by scholars as representing a key theme in a number of different religions and is often studied in a comparative context. That is, comparing various ideas about what salvation is and how it is obtained. And so, you can impress your priest next time you guys talk by correctly using the word soteriology. And so if you brought up how you understand the correct soteriological doctrine of the Eastern Orthodox Church, it may raise a few eyebrows and be impressive to some. So soteriology, again, is a very important theological term that we should know and be able to use competently. The next term that I included is syncretism. Now, I've talked about syncretism, I've talked about perennialism, I've talked about this idea that all religions they just lead to the same mountaintop, right? They're the same pathways. Wrong, fundamental contradiction, can't be true, thanks for trying. Syncretism is that idea. And so whether you look at the sort of perennial philosophy of Aldous Huxley or the Prisca Theologia of the post-Renaissance, right, that sort of Hermetic project of looking at for that ancient wisdom, that underlying unity. So syncretism is the attempt to reconcile disparate, even opposing beliefs and meld practices of various schools of thought. It is especially associated with the attempt to merge or analogize several originally discrete traditions, especially in the theology and mythology of religion, and thus to assert an underlying unity. And an attempt to reconcile is accurate and basically all it is, because it is just an attempt. Because at any deeper logical, critical analysis of syncretism, we see that just can't be the case. So next term that we have, again, a very important one. So again, I would put an asterisk next to this one with soteriology, pneumatology, ontology, epistemology, and eschatology. Eschatology was another important one. This one, teleology. You got to know what teleology means. Teleology is very important. Teleology is a reason for explanation for something as a function of its end, its purpose or goal. Telos literally means end in Greek. So natural theology, common in classical philosophy, though controversial today, contends that natural entities also have intrinsic purposes, irrespective of human use or opinion. For instance, Aristotle claimed that an acorn's intrinsic telos is to become a fully grown oak tree. And so you can see how telos is this idea that things have potential within themselves that have yet to be actualized, and therefore a fully actualized thing moves towards its end, its purpose. So we as humans have purposes. From an Orthodox understanding, our telos is theosis, right? So teleology is another very important term in regards to the ends of things, the purposes of things. And this is related then to the next term, and that's why I wrote this, is teleologism. Teleologism, the supposition that there is a design, a purpose, a directive principle, or finality to the works or processes of nature, and that philosophical study of that purpose. Teleology stands in contrast to philosophical naturalism, and both ask questions separate from the questions of science. While science investigates natural laws and phenomena, physical Sorry, I lost my place. While science investigates natural laws and phenomena, philosophical naturalism and teleology investigate the existence of non-existence of an organizing principle behind those natural laws and phenomena. Philosophical naturalism asserts that there are no such principles, while teleology asserts that there are. So, useful concept and term to know. Teleology, telos, the ends of things, the intrinsic purposes of things, right? That potentiality of that acorn to become an oak tree. That is the telos of the acorn. And so I think this is a great way to begin to just take, if you're just sitting and reflecting in nature, let's just start thinking about the telos of things, their ends and their purposes. Just like Aristotle described with the acorn. So 2 more terms and we are done. The next term that I've used over and over again is Thomism. Thomism. And so what do people mean when they always refer to Thomism? Well, they refer to the philosophical school that followed in the legacy of Thomas Aquinas. And the word comes from the name of its originator, whose summary of the Summa Theologia was arguably been second to only the Bible in the importance to the Catholic Church. Now, mind you, Thomas Aquinas wanted to, before his deathbed, this is from my understanding, so you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but Thomas Aquinas actually wanted to burn the Summa before he died, but of course he didn't have that opportunity, and so Thomism is considered to be the official theology of Catholicism. And so there are some theological distinctions that we as Orthodox would definitely levy at the Catholic Church because of their adoption of Thomism as opposed to Palimism, or really just Orthodox theology. And so it's going to come down really to the energy essence distinction, or apophatic and cataphatic theology. Now, Thomas Aquinas was actually very familiar with and liked St. Dionysius, right, who we get our mystical theology from, the divine names, much of our apophatic theology, right? And so this really is the crux of the Orthodox contentions with Thomism, is the failure to maintain and recognize the energy essence distinction, and what seems to collapse those things and make essentialist claims about God and how we interact with God. So that is Thomism. Again, if you're not familiar, just look up Thomas Aquinas. And the last term that I thought was important, again, this is just a basic overview, I'm sure there's plenty that I forgot, is transcendental idealism. And why did I include transcendental idealism? Because transcendental idealism is so important for the development of what we would call a presuppositional argument. Presuppositions. This is what Kant is doing with his transcendental idealism and his attack, right? Because he's hammering the radical empiricism of somebody like a David Hume, his radical skepticism, his empiricist worldview, and transcendental idealism is really talking about how there is a real world out there, but we only know it as much as, based on the categories we bring to those experiences. And so transcendental idealism, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and later Kantian and German idealist philosophers, according to which human experience is not of things as they are in themselves, right, but of those things as they appear to human beings. It differs from standard empirical idealism in that it does not claim that the objects of human experience would be in any sense within the mind. The idea is that whenever humans experience something, they experience it as it is for themselves. The object is real as well as mind independent, but it is, in a sense, altered by people's cognition, by the categories and the forms of sensibility, space, and time. Transcendental idealism denies that people could have knowledge of the thing in itself. The opposite view is sometimes called transcendental realism. So again, what Kant is doing here with his transcendental idealism is saying that, well, you can't totally know the thing in and of itself because you're limited by your paradigm. You're limited by your presuppositions. You're limited by the categories and the biases you're bringing to any experience. Therefore, those are different for each person. Therefore, those things limit how much they can know reality in and of itself, but that reality, he would agree, is actually there. And so that transcendental idealism is really important because it is often pointed as the beginning of presuppositional understandings, or even for the way we use the transcendental argument for God, the tag approach to God. Very, very interesting. That is the end of my list. Again, guys, please smash that like button if you have not. I would greatly, greatly appreciate it. Let me know what you guys think. Does anybody have any questions or super chats? I will get to them now. So, looks like we have one. Ephraim threw in $4.99. Thank you very much, brother. He says, would you be able to share your list for further review? Yes, I could do that. All you have to do, here's two ideas. One, you could personally email me, or my other thought was if you go to my website and just sit there for about 20 seconds, it'll pop up for you to get on my emailing list. And what I was thinking about doing is just sending it out to everybody on the emailing list. So if that's something you would be interested in, we could do that. Or if you want, I can just send it to you personally. But getting on the email list would be great, because in case anything were to happen, I get deplatformed. Email lists are great ways to directly get in contact with somebody, right? Because again, all the social media networks, they can cut you off. And theoretically, if they were to do that, how would I reach out to anybody? Well, I would reach out to them through the email networks. And so, Ephraim, if you want to go to my website and sign up on the email list, I was thinking about just sending that. That would be the first email to all the people who've signed up on the email list. It would be this list of important theological and philosophical terms. But you can also just reach out to me privately at churchoftheeternallogos.com, or churchoftheeternallogos at gmail.com, churchoftheeternallogos at gmail.com. But what I planned on doing is sending it out to everybody on the email list. And Marco Ramos says, I'm on that list. Send it out. Will do, brother. That was kind of my thought, is sending this list out to everybody who's signed up on the email list, and therefore benefiting those groups of people who have actually taken the initiative to stay in contact and have visited the website. So, yeah, that's what I have to say about that, and would be probably the best way for me to get it out to everybody. So maybe I'll send that out through the email list in the next day or two. So if anybody has any other super chats or any questions, I will take those right now. Let me flip over to D Live, see if anybody's over there with some questions. We got one person here. Truth Eli's over here. Hey, buddy. He's killing it over here in the D Live in the D Live chat. And guys, if you're interested, also let me grab this my D Live link and throw it over here in the YouTube chat. So if you guys have a D Live, definitely go find me over there and follow. I would definitely appreciate that. But doesn't look like anybody has any more questions for this evening. So I'll probably end up just turning this stream off. We've already been streaming for 2 hours. My gosh. It just seems to go on and on and on and on. But anyways, guys, appreciate you. Very much appreciate all the love and support. Let me turn this off right here. There. Very much appreciate you guys. Appreciate all the love and support. I really do. Again, we got a lot of things in the works here. The exclusive content is coming here soon, where we will be doing half these live streams will actually be hosted. The second half will be hosted off my own server on a stream at my website that will be available for all website members. And I'm also going to be doing adding a new dimension to this channel, which is going to be fitness. And so doing fitness videos, talking about men's health. Hippie housewife said, "Oh no, did I just get here just in time for the end?" Yeah, I'm sorry. Again, we've been talking about words and definitions for about 2 hours now. I'm sorry, but it is the tail end of the events this evening. But if you guys would like, please go to my website, davidpatrickcarey.com, and if you are in a position which you're able to contribute just $5 a month, a cup of coffee would go a very, very, very long way, and I would greatly, greatly appreciate that. But it doesn't look like anybody has any more questions, and it's already been a couple hours, so I think I'm going to hop off here and enjoy the rest of my evening. I hope all you guys enjoy the rest of your evening. God bless you and yours to everybody out there. And I will see you guys Thursday. I've yet to decide on the streaming topic for Thursday. I have a handful of different ideas, but I haven't done the research and the preparation yet. So I don't know what we're going to be streaming about Thursday, but we will be streaming Thursday. So I'll definitely come up with an interesting idea, as I usually do. But if you guys have some ideas, feel free to email me again at churchoftheeternallogos at gmail.com, churchoftheeternallogos at gmail.com, and we can definitely work together to get a great topic for Thursday. But anyways, with that being said, I'm out of here. Again, thank you guys for all the love and support. I truly, truly appreciate it. And as always, until next time, God bless.